Welcome to Building Better, the series where I improve upon my passions and values and then explain what I know. Today I want to talk about routines, habits, and personal life management systems. I think we all live in a cultural environment that puts up a lot of barriers in the way of a self-directed and intentional lifestyle. The economic rat race, Sisyphean hill of hustle culture, and attention-driven core of the internet want to commodify your every waking moment. Gender roles and cringe culture actively inhibit self-expression while encouraging the self-policing of harmless behavior. Constant access to hollow entertainment and the gradual killing of critical thinking has numbed the ability for the average person to even think deeply about what they want out of their life. These are emergent systemic problems, but as an individual, you can create the dedicated time it takes to break these complex cycles of maladaptive behavior. What I want to talk about today is a way to gradually make room for this dedicated time by combining personal inquiry and quantifiable data in an externalized brain. This is your mental space station, orbiting your slice of the universe and collecting information to make that slice a little bit more habitable. I'm going to talk about some basic principles first, move into some desired outcomes, and then finally the implementation of this system of tools. All of that out of the way, let's get started. Part 1, Basic Principles. The first of our principles is that you can't produce force from a place of instability. You see, your muscles, when they detect that you're on an unstable surface, will limit the amount of force you generate so as to not hurt yourself. Of course, with training, you can overcome this limiting factor and produce the same amount of force that you would from a stable position, but doing so requires a lot more effort, producing more physical and mental fatigue. The same is true for your efforts in life. Consider your emotional state to be the life support of your space station. It doesn't matter how determined, motivated, disciplined, and trained you are, you will need to, at some point, settle down and choose the tasks ahead from a place of emotional sobriety and safety. So you ought to prioritize that stability if you want any hope of keeping the station in good function. Let me be clear that powering through emotional hardship is a necessary skill to develop, but it can't be the default state. It takes too much bandwidth and resources that could otherwise serve you better. The second of our principles is to minimize background programs. Brains and computers both have a limited amount of resources that can be dedicated to any given task, and some tasks like to run in the background, either because they're necessary or so they can be accessed quickly. Eventually, if you have a lot of programs that run in the background, you'll find that your computer is slowing down because too many of its resources are dedicated to things that you don't need at the moment. The brain really isn't so different. Most people aren't suited for multitasking, cognitively demanding tasks. You can certainly do some heavy thinking while doing menial labor, but it's best for deep thinking to be uninterrupted as much as possible. This includes having entertainment on as background noise, which has its utility in increasing motivation through elevated dopamine, or by suppressing other background noise, but it can become its own source of distraction soon enough. Your space station works best when it's focused on a handful of tasks at a given time. Stretching your resources too thin means that nothing you do progresses as well as it could, and that's okay as long as you're making this decision consciously. The last of our principles is that you cannot do everything. Most people are only capable of around 4 hours of quality mental work per day, and while we can always grind out more lower quality work, the value of doing that is purely situational. Consider this kind of prioritization to be mission control, the ability to pick what you're going to do and what you're not going to do on a changing basis. More is not always better, and sometimes the pursuit of more can be detrimental to short or long term health. You're free to make these decisions, but you need to do it with the understanding that you probably won't be successful in doing everything, and that's okay. The reason why I call these principles is because they're the supporting structure that keeps everything else in the space station running. A big part of this kind of directed self inquiry is being okay with boredom, and a lot of it. Boredom feels unpleasant, but how we respond to it tells us a lot about how we can adjust and auto regulate our level of activity on any given day. There's no step by step process, just a series of things that you can do to make room for your goals. Part 2, Desired Outcomes. Your space station exists to monitor and research how you live your life. Or more accurately, it gives you the space to monitor and research your own life for your own reasons, whatever they may be. Learning how to live life is a mostly self-driven process, so we want to make as much room as possible for our decision-making to be free of confusion, distraction, and pressure as possible. So our first desired outcome is actually boredom. More accurately, we want unstructured time with limited ways to entertain ourselves. This might sound a little weird, but the brain is really good at backlogging thoughts and emotions and then processing them when it has downtime. If the backlog gets too big, then whether you like it or not, the brain is going to want to get through them. But since it often does so in a fatigued state with barely any time at all before sleep kicks in, it doesn't really make a lot of progress. This is where practices like digital fasting, journaling, and meditation come into play.
These practices give your brain the resources and environment that it needs to close these open loops that you've accumulated throughout the day, week, and month. The machinery of the space station needs time to warm up and cool down. Rest is not negotiable, in fact, it's completely mandatory. Our second desired outcome is self knowledge. Well, what do I mean by that? I mean qualitative and quantitative data about your habits, mood, use of time, and deep experience. Well, what do I mean by deep experience? I mean the thoughts and lessons that you're distilling out of your subjective view of the world. There's that saying from Socrates, that old Greek influencer, that the unexamined life is not worth living. For our purposes, I would adjust that to the unexamined life is never lived, because if you never think about what you're doing and why, then you're arguably not even making your own decisions. You don't have to struggle over every last minutia of detail in your life. In fact, we want to exactly avoid that. But we do want to develop an awareness of what works and doesn't work for us as individuals. And the only way we can really do that is by collecting and examining data from ourselves. Tools like journals, mood trackers, and time loggers make up the suite of instruments that your space station uses to monitor the metaphorical planet that is you. It is incredibly important that we use this data to build a platform of self acceptance before launching into targeted self development. Shame is a useful emotion if and only if you direct it toward behaviors, not yourself, which is much harder than it sounds. When I say self acceptance, I mean acknowledging the facts of your life without judgment, either good or bad. Self acceptance is about achieving an emotional sobriety when thinking about yourself. Our third desired outcome is to enable action in relation to the outside world. There is a pitfall in the construction of the personal space station, and that is rumination. Information has extremely limited value on its own. The ultimate goal of the personal space station is to enable authentic decision making and action. There's no way to move forward by standing still. You should certainly stand still to rest and recover when you need it, but ultimately you can't become too attached to the relative safety of your tools and thoughts. The scientific method requires the experiment, and that means you risk discarding everything you have known up to that point, and that's generally a good thing. Climbing a mountain means that eventually you'll have to let go with one of your hands and grab another outcropping. It's the only way up. The information and processing time we get out of the space station exists so that we can decide on our next priority back on the ground. Once you're on the ground, you're going to try something and fail. You're going to practice, reflect, and go back to practicing. Test the models designed in the space station, touch some grass, and beam that information right back up to where it can reframe everything else that you currently know. The reality check is the most important thing you can ever experience, where your expectations come crumbling down and you see the world for what it is. And I mean what it actually is, not a doomer's or pessimist's understanding of the world. Thoughts should result in action, and we want to tailor our space station to enable that as much as possible. All of that being said, let's get to implementing these tools that I've been mentioning. Part 3, time and place. So for our first desired outcome of unstructured time with limited entertainment, we want app blockers, site blockers, and delineation between work, play, and recovery. During the COVID lockdowns, we learned pretty quickly that doing everything in one room is generally bad for performance and rest. Going different places and having different environments makes it easier to get into the right mindset for whatever you're doing. This kind of change in environment lets your brain clear out any attention residue and makes it harder for you to get distracted. So people learn to create these kinds of divisions for themselves. Especially when working with digital devices, people physically separated their work and play to generally good effect, since they reinforce the patterns of working and playing as distinct from one another. We can apply the same principle to time, in particular the first and last few hours of your day. Kicking off the morning with high dopaminergic activities has cascading effects on your ability to exert sustained effort throughout the day. By restricting the sources of dopamine that you have in the mornings, effectively choosing between boredom and advancing your goals, you're increasing the odds that you get engrossed in your own work because it'll probably be the most interesting thing you've done that morning. Your brain keeps a rough record of how much work constitutes a good day, but it counts activity in the first 4 hours of waking as worth more than work done later in the day. If your brain isn't satisfied with the work you've done, then it induces wakefulness even when you want to sleep. When it comes to nighttime rituals and routines, you want to gradually come down off technology and psychological energy. There's a lot that's already been said about the physiological effect of blue light, but honestly, I'm less interested in that than the value of settling your thoughts as much as possible before bed. Your space station needs time to process and organize the data it's collected before going into the next day. And likewise, your brain needs unoccupied time to close open loops of emotion. There's really no other solution besides pushing your emotions down, which only makes their eventual return worse. So try this. A few hours before you sleep, unplug as much as possible. No video games, no shows, especially no social media. Reading and music can get passes, but even then your mileage may vary. The point is to deeply relax, though you might have to unwind and blow off some steam before doing so. Ultimately, what we care about are the broad strokes of how your mental energy aligns with the activities that you're engaging in throughout the day. You want to gradually ramp up the mental stimulation you get throughout the day and then gradually bring that energy back down at the end to increase your odds of sleeping better and going into the next day well rested. Part 4, Know Thyself. So, what exactly are we doing in these unstructured hours? We'll be pursuing our second desired outcome, self knowledge. Practices like journaling and meditation take time, in particular, time where sources of distraction aren't easily accessed. Conveniently, though, we've built this time into our day. Journaling and meditation can mean a lot of different things, so I'm going to talk about a sample journaling method and then some possible meditation practices. I journal in four distinct phases, two on each page of a two-page spread. The first is a Japanese journaling practice called Naiken, where I go over the day and write about something I received from somebody, something I gave to somebody, and some way that I inconvenienced somebody else. I use it because it grounds me in the world and fights off rumination and overthinking. The second is a general emotional overview of the day, thinking about what felt energizing, what felt draining, and why. The third is a kind of narrative framing, where I trace any lifelong patterns that I am trying to reinforce or break. The fourth is a small commonplace section, where I write down any quotes that I found relevant to the day. You don't have to journal the way that I do, but I find that these four phases keep me most grounded and honest with myself. Meditation is an extremely broad category of mental and spiritual practices, so I recommend looking into a source like Dr. K from healthygamer.gg for meditative practices that are communicated in a way that's easy to understand. In the mornings, I prefer focusing meditations like fixed point gazing and third eye meditations, where the goal is to direct your attention towards a small area and continually return your attention to that same area whenever it drifts. At night, I prefer body scan and mindfulness meditations where the focus is more on maintaining observation over your internal state. I recommend doing these after you wake up and right before sleeping, and by no means does it have to be an hour of silence. From what I know, the minimum effective dose of meditative practice is between 10 and 20 minutes total per day. Beyond qualitative experiences like journaling, you might want to go a step further and try to capture your life in numbers, constructing what's called a quantified self. We only really need to track three things: mood, habits, and time use. Recording what you do, when you do it, and how you feel while you're doing it in as objective a sense as possible opens a lot of doors for achieving our goals. I use Dailyo for my mood and habits. Your data is locally stored, exportable to PDF and CSV, and the app automatically suggests patterns of how your activities affect your mood. The app has some customization, which is nice, but the base functionality is more than enough for our purposes, with regular reminders, habit tracking, and a diary that can take text, audio, and images. There is a premium version of the app that I use, but it's a one-time purchase instead of a subscription, which I find very useful. For my time tracking, I use Toggle Track because it can sync between multiple devices on multiple platforms and can export your data into CSV or PDF files. Toggle Track is meant more for working applications, but it serves just fine for personal time tracking. I'm still searching for a good free open source software alternative to Toggle, but that's neither here nor there at the moment. Between the subjective experiences captured in your journals and the objective data captured in these logging apps, your space station is collecting a systemic log of diagnostics that inform your decision making. Part 5, Getting Things Done by Building a Second Brain. We touched on this earlier, but I'd like to reiterate that simply reflecting isn't enough to actually change your life or achieve your goals. There's a temptation, especially if you've gotten into the habit of maladaptive daydreaming like I have, to whiteboard theory craft life. This is just an emotional coping mechanism, but one that actively unprepares you for living. Ideas need to be tested in order to have any value, and any meaningful form of practice is characterized by careful review and examination. So far, we have the systems that enable us to review and examine our lives, but nothing that directly supports taking action yet. Our space station lacks communication arrays, and our little planet doesn't have any radio antenna or structures to execute on the plans and information that's getting beamed down to it. So let's fix that. We want a few tools, in particular a second brain, a calendar, a project manager, and a task manager. What do I mean by that? Well, let's start with a second brain. All information that you encounter, every last meme, tidbit, or compendium of knowledge you've collected, is in one of three states: immediately actionable, potentially actionable, or not actionable yet. A second brain is essentially a digital repository of everything that you want to have access to but don't want to dedicate to memory. Taking pages out of the books, getting things done, and building a second brain, your brain is much better at generating and synthesizing ideas, what's called higher order thinking in Bloom's revised taxonomy, than rote memorization. So you can get a huge amount of mileage out of offloading your lower order thinking like memory and data processing to a digital tool. Structuring a second brain is an act of information architecture, which can be really complex, but the bare minimum effectiveness places all information into four major categories. The projects folder, which contains all information which is immediately actionable and needs to be on hand for quick reference. The areas folder, which further categorizes information by what part of your personal lifestyle it's most relevant to. These areas should be based in your values and senses of responsibility, not just something that you do. The resources folder, which contains miscellaneous information which is probably useful but doesn't fall into any distinct category. And the archives folder, which contains information that is no longer actionable until the day that it could be. The second brain is the database that your life's work continually references. There's no real restriction on what should be in it, so experiment with platform and structure. The platform I use to implement my second brain is Obsidian. Everything is locally stored, quickly accessed, easily structured, and even has linking functionality. Beyond that, Obsidian has a suite of plugins that expand the functionality of the app to interact with online calendars, visual plotting tools, and all manner of functions. With our information in order, we can talk about the calendar, project manager, and task manager. We're covering all of them in this one section because the platform I use can pull triple duty as all three with minimal difficulty. Let's talk about the calendar first. A calendar, especially if you have one that can notify you on your phone, is probably your best friend if you can use it right. Deadlines, reminders, and time blocks make up the bread and butter of self managing any projects that you want to get done. They communicate information clearly, and they're easy to edit. So I keep a calendar for the little reoccurring tasks that don't really need a lot of thought, and to always be aware of my obligations and plans. Calendars can serve as a pseudo to do list by making entries that last for entire days. And I use this for reoccurring errands and chores necessary for life upkeep. Having multiple calendars dedicated to different areas of life is also incredibly useful for visual clarity, since each calendar could have its own color scheme. Sometimes, though, a calendar's simplicity and local time frame isn't enough. If you manage any longer scale, multi stage, and multi step projects, then you want a dedicated project manager. The minimum requirements for an effective project manager are simple editing, atemporal and temporal viewing options, and rich information displays, including notes if need be. Let's go over these one by one, starting with simple editing. Projects are going to need to change over time. This is inevitable if you're actually doing things with any level of effort. We want a platform that lets us change the time frame, state, and more of the project as we need it to change. Speaking of time frame, projects will generally be in two states, active and inactive. Active projects presumably have deadlines, so you need to be able to view these projects on a timeline so you can see and adjust when they intersect, how long they'll take relative to each other, and what projects directly enable other projects. You don't want to see inactive projects on this kind of view. They need their own space where you can clearly consider what you need to do next. This is what I mean by an atemporal view. Consider it an investment portfolio for your entire life and its goals instead of your finances. I consider this kind of pseudo Kanban view with inactive projects at the top grouped by what area of life they belong to. It's information dense and enables decision making. The final, albeit somewhat optional piece of this puzzle is a dedicated task manager. Task management isn't really that complex, but it can support your goals a lot more than you think. A typical task manager will have two properties, priority and date. I honestly don't care for the date of a task. It's a waste of time for the most part, and while an overdue flag can be useful at times, who isn't keenly aware of what they missed a due date on? The task managing system that I operate on uses the GTD model for task management with four properties: context, or where you need to be to get this task done; time investment, or how long you think it will take to get this task done; energy investment, or how much focus you will need to get this task done; and impact, or how much it will affect your life to get this task done. Why this multifactorial model over a simple priority? Because priorities change and are subjective. By having everything here visibly displayed, you can adjust on the fly to changes and be reasonably certain of what you'll do next. Instead of having to weigh arbitrary priority levels, you just have to ask yourself, how badly does this need to get done today? Do I have the time? Or do I have the energy? I also implement an extra property where the task is linked to its parent project, but this is only for certain kinds of tasks.
If you're familiar with the productivity space, then you probably recognize everything I've shown so far as Notion. Notion is an extremely popular tool which can support most forms of personal management and cooperation in a working context. I don't think it's perfect for everything. It has some speed issues, but it's unmatched in how much control you have over how the data is structured and interacts with itself. Notion even acquired Crone Calendar, which is a wrapper around Google Calendar, and they've integrated the two apps fairly seamlessly, which is a huge plus. Notion and Obsidian don't always play nicely in terms of integration, which is the biggest flaw of this space station setup, but it's overcome easily enough by sticking to the use cases that these applications are best suited for. If you put all of this stuff together, you've built a support system that gives you the introspection, data, and space to direct your own life. Your ideas are stored with all your other ideas, your projects are easy to work with, and your day to day can be more relaxed since fewer things creep up on you and any surprises can get the attention they demand because you have what you need to put things off without throwing your entire schedule off. That being said, this system isn't bulletproof. About once a week, you should collect your thoughts and refine anything that you're working on. Space stations take maintenance, but they're more than worth it. That's all I have to say for this video. Join us in 4 weeks for the next installment of Building Better.